The 4% guideline, I like to call it, versus the rule, because as you alluded to, it's, I think, very adaptable and something that people should really adjust based on their own situation. But the basic idea was, it's based on some research that William Bengen, a financial planner, did back in the 90s, I think it was 1994, where his thought was to say, okay, if someone retired into the worst possible market environment in modern market history, what would have been the most that they could have taken?
It was interesting to me that the starting withdrawal rate came in your research to 5.2%. So the 4% rule became 5.2%, which is scary for a lot of folks. A lot of firees are at the 3% rule for fear, and they have a hard time spending. They have a hard time adjusting to Bill Perkins' die with zero. And the guardrails approach is more of a die with zero approach than anything else, encouraging you to live your best life when your health span is at its best too. Welcome to Catching Up to FI, a podcast on mindset, money, and life for late starters of any age on their journey to financial independence. I'm Bill, and I'm a late starter.
I'm Jackie, and I'm also a late starter, and we're your host. We're here to help you on your journey to financial independence, no matter where you're starting.
We're going to talk to experts, other late starters, and explore topics related to our mission.
Join us as we catch up to FI together.
Hello, and welcome back to Catching Up to FI. I'm Bill Yount with my co-host Jackie Heptig. Jackie, how are you doing today?
I can tell you got Becky on the brain. You just called me Jackie Heptig. Did you realize?
Oh my goodness, Jackie Heptig. All right, well,
Jackie, you're really going to confuse everyone. But I am doing great, Bill, and I'm excited for our guest today because I think for us, it was the first time that both of us had gone to the Bogleheads conference and we got to meet Christine Benz, and we left having a million questions for her. We couldn't do it at the conference, but man, we get to do it today.
Yeah, it was really an honor to go to Bogleheads. I'd wanted to do it for a long time. A lot of the guests we've had on our show were there as speakers, and I got to meet them in person. Christine as well. So let's jump right in and give her a little intro in case our audience doesn't know who she is. Our guest today is someone we got to meet at Bogleheads conference last year. She is Director of Personal Finance and Retirement Planning for Morningstar and is co-host of the great podcast, The Long View. The podcast features in-depth interviews with thought leaders in investing and personal finance. She's a frequent public speaker and is widely quoted in the media, including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Barron's, CNBC, and PBS. In 2020, Barron's named her to its inaugural list of 100 most influential women in finance. In 2021, Barron's named her as one of the 10 most influential women in wealth management. She is president and board member of the John C. Bogle Center for Financial Literacy, which is a nonprofit organization whose mission is to expand John Bogle's legacy by promoting the principles of successful investing and financial well-being throughout the education and community. She is author of several books, which includes the soon-to-be-released book titled How to Retire, 20 Lessons for a Happy, Successful, and Wealthy Retirement. Looking forward to that one. In her free time, Christine works with underprivileged women to improve their understanding of personal finance concepts. Also, something near and dear to our hearts. And I'll bet you never guess what her degree is in. It's in political science and Russian language from the University of Illinois at Champaign-Urbana. Without further ado, Christine, welcome to Catching Up to FI.
Bill and Jackie, thank you so much. It's my honor to be here. I loved meeting both of you at Bogleheads, and it's great to circle back with you.
Yeah, we have to ask right out of the gates, how did you go from a degree in Russian language to the world of investing?
Well, it was a twisty path, that's for sure. I had studied Russian for a number of years, I guess 10 years altogether. And when I exited college, I was kind of interested in moving to DC. I had been an intern in DC. The positions I was interviewing for seemed really deadly dull. So like listening in on phone calls. This was the 80s, mind you. And so I decided to move back to Chicago and had worked in a couple of positions in publishing. My dad was an avid investor, kind of an avid DIY type investor, and an early adopter of Morningstar. So he was one of the people who pointed me in the direction of Morningstar. He was like, I really love what they're doing. It seems like it has a lot of growth potential. And 30 years later, I'm still here. I still really believe in our company's mission of empowering investors through information. And that's my focus today still.
That is awesome. Christine, I retired early. And honestly, if I had your job, looking at the stuff you're doing with the Bogleheads and your job at Morningstar and your passion for financial education, you get to do that every day. I would not have retired early. I'd still be working that job.
Well, Jackie, that's so nice of you to hear. That's what I'm aiming for, is like to just try to continue doing this as long as I can, not so much for financial reasons, because that's kind of solved for us, luckily, but because I really enjoy it. And the more research I see on this topic of working in some capacity, whether it's paid work or unpaid work, it just is so beneficial on a lot of levels. So there's the social aspect, of course, the sense of purpose, even a little bit of physical activity. So all that stuff, relationships, I find a huge benefit of working. So I want to continue doing it.
Yeah, I mean, I used Morningstar when I was learning to get up going with the investing. One of your things that you offer is the X-ray portfolio, where you help people understand what the composition of their portfolio and what they can do and tweak it to reach their successful portfolio. Are there other things that, say, for even late starters or early investors, that Morningstar offers as far as education that you want to let our audience know where to jump in?
Yeah, so my team, it's a fairly small team at Morningstar, but it's a pure research effort in the realm of portfolio construction and retirement planning. We touch financial planning to some extent as well. So, really, our motivation is just to sort of ask those questions like, what are people's pain points? What are their questions? And how can we help address them with information and education and research? So, we work on this annual study, which I know we're going to discuss today, where we look at, okay, what's a safe withdrawal rate for people embarking on retirement at various ages. I recently contributed to some research along with my colleagues, Amy Arnott and Karen Zaya, and it's not lost on us that we're three women researchers and we love working on this project. But the goal is to sort of say, okay, if you have US stocks as your core building blocks for your portfolio, what are your next best additions? What things really help diversify that US equity portfolio? This is some research that Amy has been leading for us for the past 3 years. The recent conclusions, maybe not surprisingly, were fairly vanilla asset classes. So we found that despite 2022, which of course was a rough market for high quality bonds have historically been a superb diversifier for equities, and cash is also a good thing to have. So you don't need to venture into arcane, sort of alternative, high cost investments to get a well diversified portfolio. We really think those three key building blocks can help people get things done. And of course, you'd want to add other asset classes like international equity, or I believe you should, but you don't have to venture too far out there to build a diversified portfolio.
It's good to hear that you add international, because that's a common, hotly debated topic. John Bogle said no. J.L. Collins says no. Others we've interviewed have said yes. And then they debate how much. I'm a firm believer in international, and it's great to hear that you are too. What percentage, just as an aside for our audience, do you recommend an international in their portfolio?
Sure. And Bill, by the way, I would say the data say no too. Like when you look at recent performance, it is not encouraging from the standpoint of international diversification. It has not added value. But in terms of the percentage allocation, I would use the global market capitalization, so that the value of the US market relative to non US equities is kind of a starting point for thinking about that question. And of course, it ebbs and flows a little bit over time. It's been sort of in the neighborhood of 50 to 60% US equities over the past couple of decades. But you could kind of use that as a starting point when figuring out how to apportion your assets. And then think about your life stage. So I would say that global market cap is a really good benchmark for people who are, say, under 50, people who are still earning and saving and have many years until decumulation. But for people who are getting close to retirement, those who are, say, 50, 60 and above, I would actually argue for scaling back non-US a little bit relative to US, because you just pick up some foreign currency volatility with the non-US. And so it's just sort of a wild card of volatility that you don't have with that US only portfolio. But I do think that investors should keep the faith in non-US. And one key reason is that we've had the US market behave in a very specific way where it's been quite beholden to the large growth, Magnificent Seven type technology stocks that has redounded to the benefit of US investors. But I see non-US stocks as being kind of a backdoor value player, a way to kind of rebalance away from some forces in the US market that have performed really well. So that's, I think, my main thesis for keeping the faith in non-US, that eventually we see reversion to the mean. US stocks won't continue to cycle up forever. And I think at some point, investors will be glad that they have that non-US exposure in their portfolios.
Well, it's so interesting how the international piece has changed because I remember when I was much younger, I was working and I think it was in our 401k, we had like an emerging market fund. That was awesome. And I want to say this was probably more like prior to 2008. So 2005, 2006, 2007. And man, that fund performed better than any other one. I remember us one day, everybody's changing everything to emerging markets. And that's when it was really great. I have not seen non-US markets perform that way ever since. So it's amazing with the changes.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, Jackie. There was this period, we sometimes call it the lost decade for US stocks from 2000 through 2009, where US stocks basically flatlined in large part because you had that dot-com bust at the early end of that period. And then, of course, you had the great financial crisis in the sort of the 2007, 2009 period. US stocks basically flatlined in part because they were quite expensive at the beginning of that period. Non-US stocks picked up the slack during that period. They performed exceptionally well and far outperformed US during that period. But that's sort of receding from people's memory now. And
Right.
so I think that it accentuates that bias toward, yeah, why bother with non-US? Non-US never outperforms. Well, you just referenced,
Yeah.
Jackie, a period when non-US outperformed by a lot.
Yeah.
Well, I find it interesting that for our late start audience, they scaling it back at that time. I haven't. I haven't thought about it, but maybe I now will. I see your point, but looking at my investing lifetime with another 30, 40 years, I think staying the course, if you have done that, is not a bad idea as opposed to chasing performance. What do you think?
Well, I think you're right, Bill, in terms of the timing of that scaling back, that you could be selling yourself out or at least reducing your weighting in non-US at what in hindsight could turn out to be an inopportune time. But our team does do a glide path for various asset class exposures that coincides with life stage. So rather than like recommending the same percentage of small value as a percentage of US equity, that's another bet that they would suggest that investors kind of scale back on as their time horizon shrinks. And the simple thought there is, well, it's not necessarily a simple thought, but the idea there is that with fewer years left, that potentially you have fewer years to benefit from what has been a trend that has been observed over very long periods of time. But the timing on trimming back non-US, I would agree with you, is not great and could be construed as performance chasing.
That's interesting that you have that research. We'd be interested in a link to it because I think our
Sure.
audience would be very interested in your glide path recommendations, which would apply to the late starter audience in the 40s, 50s.
Yeah, the idea is that everyone doesn't want to maintain the same sub-asset class exposures throughout the retirement time horizon. So another example would be like Treasury inflation protected securities. If you're an earner and you are getting a salary and you're presumably eligible for cost of living increases as the years go by, don't worry about an asset class like Treasury inflation protected securities. But certainly as you get older and get closer to retirement and actually spending from that portfolio, it's important to embed securities within your fixed income exposures that will help preserve your purchasing power. So that's another example of how the intra-asset class exposures would change over time.
It's interesting because I recently spoke with Mike Piper, and he's been on the show, and he had famously been in a life strategy fund, a one fund approach. Recently, because of buying a house or something like that, he changed and he went into VT, or the total world, with a tips ladder at the back end. And Jonathan Clements has the same approach now, simplifying it to those kind of tips and total world portfolios. Granted, they're a little younger, but seeing this trend is interesting because that's kind of my philosophy. Not that I'm promoting this to everybody else in our audience, but I can't just plan for myself as the CFO of my family. I have to plan for my wife's lack of interest in portfolio management and make it simple for her.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I love those ultra simple portfolios, but I also appreciate the intuition around Mike's switch because it truly, as you get closer to drawdown, I think it is valuable to have discrete building blocks in the portfolio that you might have a year where you absolutely would not want to touch your equities, but you'd need to get some cash flows out of your portfolio. Well, that's the value of not having a single all-in-one fund, as good as they can be in the accumulation years. When it comes to drawdown, you really want something that you can tap without disturbing your equity allocation, and vice versa. If bonds are in some type of trough, but stocks have ascended, and that's rarely really a scenario, but to the extent that that might be, that would allow you to tap your stocks and leave your bonds alone.
All right, great. Well, we've gotten away from our primary focus. Jackie, we want to talk
Yeah.
today about the 4% rule. I mean, it is gospel. It is absolutely gospel in the FI community. And we find that, it's a rule of thumb, but is it really something that applies universally? And are there other ways to think about it? You wrote a paper with your colleagues called The State of Retirement Income 2023. Stronger fixed income returns boost starting safe withdrawal percentages to 4%, their highest levels in 3 years. Can you take us first through what is the 4% rule? Where did it come from? What are the assumptions? And how do you find it best used for, say, late starters or any investor?
Sure. So the 4% guideline, I like to call it, versus the rule, because as you alluded to, it's, I think, very adaptable and something that people should really adjust based on their own situation. But the basic idea was it's based on some research that William Bengen, a financial planner, did back in the 90s. I think it was 1994, where his thought was to say, okay, if someone retired into the worst possible market environment in modern market history, what would have been the most that they could have taken as a starting withdrawal from that portfolio, and then inflation adjusted that dollar amount thereafter? What was the most that they could have taken? And so Bengen homed in on that kind of late 1960s, early 1970s period, which pretty much everything that could go wrong did for US investors. So you had rising interest rates that clobbered bond prices, you had high inflation, which precipitated those rising interest rates, you had falling stock prices in the 73, 74 period. So in modern market history, that's really the worst period that you could have retired into. And Bengen concluded, well, if someone wanted to have a payout over their retirement time horizon, 4% was the most that they could have taken, and then inflation adjusted it. So to use a simple example, if someone had $1 million portfolio, they could take 40,000 in year one of retirement. If inflation's 3%, the next year's withdrawal is $41,200. So that just that $40,000 adjusted by that 3% withdrawal rate. So that was Bengen's basic research. Our go at that research meant to be forward looking. So we've been working on this research for the past couple of years, where we have taken our team's forward looking stock and bond forecasts and plugged them into Monte Carlo simulations and attempted to figure out, okay, if you're embarking on retirement today, how much could you reasonably withdraw from that portfolio? When we initially did the research in 2021, the conclusion was 3.3% because starting conditions were pretty bad in 2021, where we had very low bond yields. Inflation wasn't high, but equity valuations were pretty expensive. So 3.3% in 2021, 3.8% in 2022. And then more recently, in part because of higher bond yields, we elevated that starting safe withdrawal percentage to 4% in the 2023 research. So that's just kind of a recap on how we've approached this. But the more we've looked at it, the more we have all concluded, I think, Amy, John, and I are the co-researchers on this last run of the research. I think we've all concluded that we think that people should use some variable approach. So rather than just sort of rotely taking the same amount out of the portfolio and just adjusted for inflation, that ideally people should be a little bit flexible about those withdrawals. And I think that's where those adjustments can come in for people who are embarking on financial independence or perhaps retiring early. Some considerations around flexibility, I think, are really valuable.
We are super excited for one of our new partners. It's called Create Your Own Financial Plan. And this is a comprehensive video course by our friend Cody Garrett. He's with Measure Twice Money, and he's been on our podcast. And we love this course that he has put out. So if you are a true do-it-yourselfer and you've been wanting to put together a financial plan, check him out. I've gone through the course myself, and I have nothing but praise for it and the quality of work that Cody Garrett does. Cody Garrett is a CFP, so you're getting the mind and the experience of a CFP that you can trust. You just need to go to measuretwicemoney.com/catching up, and you will get $100 off this course. And again, that is Measure Twice Money Catching Up. And Christine, I'm curious. So, what are some of those variable strategies that you mentioned?
Yeah, so we've modeled out a few different variations, but the basic idea is that these strategies are plugging into what's going on in your portfolio in each year of your retirement. So you're taking a look at your portfolio balance, taking a look at how your portfolio has behaved, and potentially making some adjustments up or down. So after a bad year like 2022, your 2023 withdrawal might be down a little bit. The idea being, okay, if you can take less from your portfolio after that bad year, that leaves more of it in place to rebound and recover when the market eventually does. And of course, the market recovered very quickly in 2023 after 2022. So it illustrated the virtue of being flexible. And on the flip side, in a really good market environment, when the portfolio has behaved really, really well, you may be able to get more. You should be able to take more from that portfolio. You should be able to give yourself a little bit of a raise. So we've experimented with a lot of different flexible strategies. I think the one that we probably all like the most, just in terms of its efficacy, is what's called the guardrails approach, which was developed by Jonathan Guyton and William Klinger. We stayed true to the basic system of guardrails in modeling that out, but it certainly allows for a higher starting withdrawal percentage as long as you're okay with the bargain, that if you do these calculations from year to year, you may have years where it's saying, hey, you know what, you need to take less, but in exchange, you can take more in the better years. So that's the basic idea. We looked at really simple variations. So one would be simply, if a portfolio has had a loss in the subsequent year, you just wouldn't give yourself any sort of inflation adjustment. So you'd use that basic 4% style withdrawal, but you would forego the inflation adjustment after that losing year. We found that that simple tweak was actually very effective in terms of increasing starting safe withdrawal percentages. So the Strategies can get a little bit wonky, a little bit complicated, but I think they're worth reading up on because the basic idea is that they help enlarge lifetime withdrawals and starting withdrawals. And those higher starting withdrawals, I think are super important because those are often kind of the pent up demand years of people's retirements where maybe they haven't had a chance to travel during their working careers, or they have things that they want to do with their time that involve money. And so those tend to be the higher spending years of retirement. If someone can enlarge their spending in those early healthy years of retirement, I think that that can be tremendously beneficial.
There was one that was new to this study this year, and you refer to it as actual spending. I found this one fascinating because we're going to talk about the pros and cons of sort of the 6 drawdown strategies that you have. And just to reiterate for folks, there's the base case we talked about, the 4% rule. There's also a tips ladder approach that maybe we should talk about too. And then you mentioned foregoing inflation adjustments and the guardrails approach. There is also an RMD's approach and then actual spending. Maybe we should talk about actual spending first and then circle back to the RMD approach.
Sure. So actual spending looked at some research, and I'm trying to remember, I think it was probably the National Bureau of Economic Research or someone did some research that we drew upon that examined actual retiree spending trajectories over their retirement time horizons. So, how did people actually spend? Did they spend in that very rote manner that I discussed, or did they vary their spending? Well, what we found is that spending generally trends down through retirement, that those early retirement years are the highest spending years of people's retirement, and then people spend less as they move through retirement. And most of us who have had older adults in our lives have probably observed a pattern like this, where maybe your parents traveled a lot out of the country early on in their retirement, but as they got older, they stayed a little closer to home. Those trips became a little shorter. So we modeled in that actual trend in spending, that downturn in spending in the late 70s, early 80s in our research. And of course, that allows for higher early withdrawals, which I think is an important finding for people who have tighter financial plans, who really want to enjoy their retirement, but also make sure that they are not going to run out. If they plan for their spending, their higher spending years to occur early on in retirement, they just have to be okay with this part of the bargain, that they will have to tighten their belts a little bit as they move through retirement. But I think we are all fans of the strategy because we don't want people to underspend. We don't want them to over economize in an effort to preserve assets for years when they may not actually need them. So I think it's something to take to heart for people who have tighter plans, especially.
Yeah, I think the simplicity of making these adjustments and the variable strategies, it just makes so much sense. And it doesn't have to be complex. It almost seems like common sense that if you didn't make quite as much in your portfolio, then maybe you pull off a little bit less. And if you have enough of a cushion, which we all hope to have that, enough of a cushion where we can do that, I mean, that just make a lot of sense. And when you were giving the example earlier about the $1 million, and you take off 4% and you add inflation, and that's kind of where I was. I retired in December 2019, not knowing anything about the pandemic. And then the pandemic hit. So of course, my heart's like dropping and I'm thinking, oh my God, I retired at the wrong time and all of that. And then we know that it bounced back and everything, but I already had in my head that I wasn't going to pull out. And I tried to set it up to where at least 3 years I had liquid expenses to cover everything. So I didn't even have to depend on the market. But yeah, that makes so much sense that, hey, you just make adjustments. If the market's having a great year, you can take a little bit more. If it's not, maybe take a little bit less, but especially when you have these long time horizons like I do, that I put a lot more thought into it, knowing that I don't fall into that typical 65 or so. So yeah, I appreciate that. This is making a lot of sense to me.
Right. Well, Jackie, I think that it does make intuitive sense. And the fact is, even before we're retired, we're used to making these course corrections in our households, right? Like you might have changes in your income for whatever reason, maybe things that you are behind or things that force your hand where you have to spend less. So most people are used to making some adjustments in their spending from year to year. And then another thing I would say with respect to these variable strategies is I do think that there's a ton of value in lining up safe sources of cash flow that don't relate to your portfolio. So, like whatever you can do to enlarge those coming into retirement is really valuable. So, being thoughtful about when you're claiming Social Security, for example, with an eye toward enlarging that benefit, potentially contemplating some sort of an annuity purchase to help, maybe in combination with Social Security, to help ensure that you have your basic expenses that are going to be covered by these non-portfolio income sources. And I think those sorts of things give you a lot more flexibility with respect to your cash flows from your portfolio. Like if you know you can cover your housing costs and your food costs and your insurance and all your basics, I think that most people would be comfortable adjusting the rest of their spending,
Yeah,
the
because
portfolio spending accordingly.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point for our late starters. Delaying the high earner Social Security, looking at Mike Piper's open Social Security calculator to help you figure that out because it is a superpower of the late starter. People backstab annuities all the time, but we've heard in prior episodes that, looking at around 70 years old to avoid longevity risk, buying an annuity and using Social Security for your basic income floor really is a smart strategy where your portfolio is protected and your lifestyle is covered. You don't have to worry as much, right?
Well, exactly. And peace of mind is such a huge portion of this, but rising interest rates are a real benefit to the annuity purchaser. And by the way, I'm not being paid in any way by the insurance industry, but I have really warmed up to very basic annuity products just with an eye toward helping pad people's basic living expenses. And the other thing is, one big knock on annuities, without going too far in the weeds on this, is that you can't buy an annuity, even a basic annuity, with a CPI inflation adjustment. So you won't necessarily be made whole with respect to inflation in an annuity. But I think if you think about the research that I just referenced, where when we look at actual retiree spending, people don't necessarily spend in line with inflation as they age, I think that could potentially give you a little bit more comfort with an annuity purchase, that it won't just, that your purchasing power won't just be completely corroded by inflation, because your actual spending very likely will trend down.
Yeah, that's what we would call the personal rate of inflation, which people don't think about as much as opposed to CPI inflation. We
Yeah.
tend to spend, we get scared of inflation, but really you got to look at, what do I do? What is my inflationary rate? And how does that impact my spending? So there are definitely personal ways of looking at this as opposed to being the fear factor of market based ways of looking at it.
Yeah, such an important point. I often mentally reference Jason Zweig's great column from like 20 years ago, where he called it meflation. This idea that your inflation rate is not CPI, it's whatever you're spending on that consumption basket. One thing older adults have going for them is that majority own their homes and do not have mortgages even. And so that tends to be very beneficial from the standpoint of inflation, whereas renters and certainly new home purchasers today are very much affected by inflation. On the flip side, one negative from the standpoint of inflation for older adults is that healthcare expenses have historically been inflating higher than the general inflation rate, although I think that has tapered off a little bit recently. But that's a headwind potentially for older adults, because that the healthcare
oh,
spending
and
is a
uh,
bigger share of their consumption baskets typically.
Okay, we have all these 6 cases of variable spending rates. I think it's important to our audience to understand the pros and the cons of each. So let's walk through briefly, because I became enamored with the actual spending because of the pros and cons. But what are the pros and cons of say the base case for people, the typical Bengen 50-50 portfolio, 4% rule. What are those pros and cons?
Well, the big pro is that it's kind of a paycheck equivalent, where if you've been someone who has been working for an employer for many years, you probably don't want a lot of variability in your cash flows. And so that's the chief benefit, is that someone could effectively just set up that starting withdrawal amount and run with it and have basically a straight line in terms of their paydays throughout retirement. So that is probably the chief benefit. A secondary benefit is that that type of spending strategy where you set your initial percentage and basically never look back, is that when we look at how much is left over at the end of, say, a 30-year period, that sort of spending pattern tends to be pretty conservative. So it leaves pretty nice leftover balances. Oftentimes, the market is much better than that worst case scenario that the 4% guideline is assuming. And so, oftentimes, if people are just decumulating at that 4% starting withdrawal percentage with that dollar amount inflation adjusted thereafter, it'll leave them with pretty big leftovers. So, those are the two key positives. The negatives, I think, are many. And I've come to view it as almost a little bit of a straw man in terms of thinking about retirement spending. And the main one is the actual spending, which is the strategy that you're enamored of, Bill, shows that people don't actually spend that way at all, that they do, in fact, vary their spending. They might make voluntary reductions when the market is bad, but importantly, they just spend less as they move through those later years of retirement. And the 4% guideline doesn't do that at all. In fact, you're giving yourself a little bit of a raise each year throughout retirement. So it doesn't sync up with retirees' actual spending patterns. I see that as the chief negative. And then I think you could also look at those big leftover amounts, the too conservative thing, as a negative for people who want to maximize their consumptions during their own lifetimes. And maybe they don't have kids, or their kids are launched and don't care about inheriting anything. In that case, that retiree sticking with that 4% style spending is under consuming relative to what he or she probably could do. And I see that as a fairly significant negative for that strategy.
What about the positive and negatives of the Guyton Klinger guardrail strategy? This is significantly different. I know that Becky Cummings-Koski,
There you go again, Bill.
Becky Hepday, our prior host, I did that on purpose. I know that she uses a guardrails approach. What are the pros and cons there?
So the key pros are your eyes pop out when you look at that starting withdrawal percentage that's allowed. It does significantly enlarge starting safe withdrawals, as long as you're okay with this idea that you will make adjustments as you go through your retirement time horizon. So starting withdrawals are much higher, and that's especially the case for people with higher equity allocations. Starting withdrawals are higher. Lifetime withdrawals are also higher. So you're periodically giving yourself a raise as the market performs well. And over many, many periods of 30-year periods of market history, the market has performed really well. So you're able to enlarge your balance and increase your lifetime payouts from the portfolio. So those are the chief advantages. The chief disadvantage, and I know I've talked to Jonathan Guyton about this and he disagrees a little bit, but it's administratively a little more complicated than some of these other more simple strategies where you're having to revisit your spending rate year by year and sort of test that spending rate. That's, I think, a drawback to the strategy. But otherwise, it's certainly the best strategy for consumption-minded retirees. Another negative is because it does encourage you to spend on an ongoing basis. So if your portfolio has performed well, you get a raise. Well, the negative of that is that you are tending to have fewer leftovers for heirs. So if that's a big priority, the strategy might be somewhat less attractive for people.
Yeah, it was interesting to me that the starting withdrawal rate came in your research to 5.2%. So the 4% rule became 5.2%, which is scary for a lot of folks. A lot of firees are at the 3% rule for fear, and they have a hard time spending. They have a hard time adjusting to Bill Perkins' die with zero. And the guardrails approach is more of a die with zero approach than anything else, encouraging you to live your best life when your health span is at its best too.
Right. And John Guyton has a beautiful metaphor for this, which we actually discussed in my book, where the way he described the 4% style spending is he said, imagine you're embarking on a road trip. And I tell you, you're not allowed to adjust your driving, your rate of speed at all during that whole road trip. And you don't know, will the roads be icy? Will they be just fine? He said you'd probably say, okay, I want to be safe rather than sorry, right? If you're telling me I have to pick this spending rate right now and I can never revisit it, I can't look back, or I have to choose my speed limit right now at the outset of this road trip, of course I'm going to be conservative. But he said the virtue of driving in a modern car with brakes and mirrors and lights and all that stuff is that you can adjust your spending, and you should plan to adjust your spending. So you might say, well, knowing that I have all these tools at my disposal on my drive, okay, maybe I'll choose 45 or something like that. And that's the basic idea behind the guardrails is like, we're going to start you out here. The data supports that if you make the course correction, if you encounter a bad market and make the prescribed course corrections, you'll be just a-okay. But you get to start with a higher spending rate. I think that's a pretty good deal. And I think people should investigate variations on the strategy. There's a firm called Income Lab that does kind of a similar sort of thing where they retest spending each year based on how probabilities of success have changed over the retiree's time horizon. So if your probability of success with a given spending rate has plummeted, well, they'll suggest that you curtail your spending somewhat. But there are all kinds of variations on this, but that's the basic idea, is that you have tools at your disposal, you have some changes you could make, and you should consider taking advantage of them.
Ooh, I really like that analogy, Christine. That makes so much sense because during people's lifetime, they can have layoffs. There's so many things that happen while you're working where you have to make adjustments. Why shouldn't we have those same thought processes when we retire and know that we'll have to make adjustments? So yeah, that analogy makes so much sense.
Hey, Catching Up to Fi audience, this is Bill Young telling you that we have some great sponsors here on our show these days. Jeremy Schneider, who's been on the show and is the founder of Personal Finance Club, has created a couple of great courses that he is giving to our audience at a $30 discount. Click on the link in the show notes to get this deal, and you can have the course, How to Money Like a Millionaire, which normally is $99, but you can get it for $69 using the code CUTOFI if you click on the link in our show notes. The other course that he does is called Build Wealth by Investing in Index Funds. And again, this course is only $99 normally, and it's such a great value already, but you can get $30 off and pay $69 for this course as well. Now, why not take them both? Buy his Ultimate Personal Finance Bundle, which again is normally $149, but you get $30 off the bundle if you use the code CUTOFI. Go to the show notes and find the link for these courses and get started on your personal finance journey.
You know, I was also curious, and I know I've heard some people get this confused, and I myself have gotten confused. Exactly, like, what is the 4% guideline? What does it factor in? So we know that it factors in inflation, right? Does it factor in taxes at all?
Yeah, Jackie, great question. And we actually got this question a lot in response to our research. We do not take taxes into account. So if you are paying taxes, so if you're, say, withdrawing from a traditional tax deferred account, your tax burden on that withdrawal would reduce your payout accordingly. So it doesn't take taxes into account. And the reason we didn't factor it directly into our research is just that this is so individual specific. specific. I think increasingly we'll have more folks coming into retirement with maybe the majority of their portfolios in Roth assets, which of course aren't subject to tax once you're of a certain age. So we didn't model it in, but it's an important consideration. So if you're
Right.
someone who's coming into retirement where the bulk of your retirement savings are in tax deferred retirement savings vehicles, traditional IRAs, traditional 401ks, and on down the line, you'd need to factor in that tax hit and your spending rate would be reduced accordingly.
Yeah, that's important to keep in mind. And I guess also along those lines, the things that could help people when they retire and with this 4% guideline is the things that it doesn't include that could help you, like Social Security. So that's not factored in, right?
Right.
And then you mentioned pensions and annuities. So if they got those things coming, then maybe 4% is not necessary anyway.
Well, exactly. And that's why I always say job one in all of this is to focus on those non-portfolio income sources, whatever you can do to enlarge them coming into portfolio drawdown. It just gives you so much flexibility and so much more power with respect to that drawdown decision. And I think that's another, people don't like to talk about work, but I think that's another benefit to potentially continuing to work in some capacity, even if it's not in an especially remunerative job, but just something that brings in a paycheck that helps reduce spending from the portfolio. That's well worth considering. I talk to so many of my friends who have corporate jobs that are very taxing and have been gratifying, but at some point they want to get out of them. And I often hear like Trader Joe's seems like such an ideal sort of setting where you're going to leave Trader Joe's at the end of your shift and you will be done. But along the way, you will have maybe gotten a little physical activity and socialized with some younger colleagues, whatever. So I think being willing to consider work in some capacity is well worth contemplating.
It certainly seems like retirees are Trader Joe's. They all wear Hawaiian shirts.
Well, and not to mention passion projects as well. There was a guy in our Catching Up to Five Facebook group, and he shovels his neighbors' driveways. And I forgot how much they paid him. I want to say like $50, but he loved to do it and he would have done it anyway. And it just gets him out. It gets him up. He's got, I guess, this big piece of equipment that does it in 10 or 15 minutes. And that's what he loves doing. And for me, I like financial education. So Bill will probably be doing financial education too. So I love the idea of like trying to find what your passion projects are. And you know what? It's okay if you make a little money from them. Or like you said, go out somewhere else and just get value from still doing other things, even after you're not tied to that job.
Yeah, one of the most inspiring podcasts we've done recently for our Longview podcast, it was with Mark Friedman, who I'd really recommend as a guest. He came up with this idea of encore careers, he calls it. And the idea is to try to figure out something to do, whether an earning job or a non-earning job, just something that is compelling to you, that gets you in touch with other people, ideally people of different generations, if possible. It's just, I think, time for us to revisit how we think about working. That if work is, for whatever reason, just this slog for you, by all means, think about how to get out, but stay active, continue to stoke that sense of purpose. I think it's absolutely crucial.
Yeah, I agree.
Jordan Grummett talks about this. You had a great conversation with him about taking stock at the Bogleheads conference, which is videoed, and they can find it on the Bogleheads website and probably should look at it and read his book. One of the things from a numbers standpoint that I want to at least pay homage to here, and it's important, we'll probably do a whole episode or two or more on this with Big Earn, Karsten Jeske, is sequence of returns risk. And we've got to pay attention to this. Our late starters really have to pay attention to this. Can you describe what it is and sort of maybe some basic strategies that we as late starters or people in general need to do in order to combat it?
Yeah, it's such an important concept, Bill, but the basic idea is that if you encounter a bad market environment, and that could be bad stock returns, bad bond returns, high inflation, maybe all three at once, like that late 1960s, early 1970s period, if you encounter that at the front end of your retirement and you're simultaneously spending from your portfolio during that time, and you're not necessarily making adjustments to acknowledge what's going on with that portfolio, well, that's much, much worse than if you encounter that bad market environment toward the end of your retirement. So I've got a slide in a presentation I often give that illustrates, like, what if those bad market returns that occurred in sort of the late 1960s, early 1970s. What if someone retired and encountered them at the tail end of their retirement? What the research shows and what the slide shows is it doesn't really matter. If that person had good market returns early on, they would be home free. They'd have been able to meet their desired spending rate. They would have even enlarged their portfolio balance over their time horizon. But if they encountered it early on in retirement, well, it makes all the difference. So, in terms of how we troubleshoot this risk factor, I would say the two key things you'd want to bring into your toolkit would be, well, think about adjusting your spending rate. So if you walk headlong into a bad market environment, think about adjusting your spending rate down. You could potentially also think about delaying retirement to get yourself through that bad market environment, but most retirees don't really love to hear that they should consider that, but that's another idea. And then the third key thing would be having your asset allocation be such that you could spend through some safer assets that are less likely to have gone down during a bad market environment. And so you wouldn't have to touch the assets that had fallen the furthest. So that's the basic intuition why we would recommend people hold some cash in their retirement portfolios, why they would hold some fixed income securities in their retirement portfolios, and fixed income securities of different duration ranges as well, that you would have your cash and then potentially move on to your short-term bonds, which have historically not had very deep troughs in terms of losses. And then potentially you could move on to the intermediate term bonds without having to touch the growth assets in the portfolio, the equity assets that would most likely have depreciated the most during such a period. So those would be the main things I'd think about as a way to mitigate sequence of return risk.
Yeah, and it's interesting because the target date portfolios take care of this for you with regards to downshifting your glide path, but a lot of people criticize them for being too conservative in retirement. I mean, people talk about bond tents and getting your allocation to, say, a 50-50 allocation or a 40-60 allocation in order to weather the storm of a sequence return risk. Do you think the glide paths of target date funds are too conservative, or are they appropriate in order to weather a sequence of returns risk problem?
I think they're appropriate, but I will say, as much as I'm an enthusiast about target date funds for the accumulation years, I'm less excited about them for people embarking on decumulation. I love their simplicity, but I do like the idea of retirees as they embark on retirement having the opportunity to pick and choose where they go for their withdrawals on a year-to-year basis. So after 2022, for example, if someone could say, okay, I'm going to leave my bonds alone, bonds have dropped. I'm going to leave my stocks alone, stocks have dropped. I'll pull from my cash for my 2023 withdrawals, right? And then after 2023, maybe you would step back and say, well, gosh, my US large growth has crushed everything else. My withdrawals are coming exclusively from my US equity component of my portfolio this year. And that's really the way I like the idea of retirees going through their withdrawals. So in addition to maybe recalculating how much to take out, the where to take it from, I think, is also an important component of this. Target date funds, as I think effective as they are for the accumulation years, do not give you that ability to pick and choose. You can't say, hey, Vanguard, target date fund manager, just give me my bond piece this year. I don't want to touch my equities, they're down. You can't do that. And that, I think, is a drawback to target date funds.
How much cash and bonds would you, as a rule of thumb, recommend for, say, a medium risk person going into retirement. I've heard of sort of the 3 to 5 year runway of cash and bonds. I've heard of sort of a 50-50 approach. I've heard of maybe 10% in cash. Do you have a rule of thumb for maybe our audience as to what they may think of? Because they're generally going to be less risk tolerant because they may have accumulated less.
Yeah, I like the idea of using your starting spending rate as the measuring stick that you would use when you're determining how much to drop into each of these asset classes. So say I'm going with this 4% spending system, I would think about having like 2 years worth of portfolio withdrawals in cash. So if my spending rate's 4%, I just multiply that by two. That's 8% of my portfolio spending in cash. And then on down the line, so with fixed income, I would think about having maybe another 5 to 8 years worth of portfolio withdrawals in a fixed income portfolio. And I would stage it by maturity where I'd have kind of the next line reserves lined up, some sort of a short term high quality bond fund, and then an intermediate term high quality bond fund. But I think maybe 5 to 8 years worth of portfolio expenditures in that next bucket of the portfolio. So that's maybe if we're using that 4% spending rate, if we're going for 8 years, that is 32% allocation of that portfolio to fixed income securities. So with my cash, I've got 8. With my bonds, I've got 32. That's 40, and then the remainder can go in sort of the growth engine of the portfolio, where it is invested in globally diversified portfolio. But that sort of 10-year sort of framework, I think, makes sense because when we look at sort of the historical performance of asset classes, there have been periods where stocks have been down for 10 years. We earlier on referenced that lost decade for stocks, 2000 through 2010. Well, stocks basically flatlined and you wouldn't have wanted to withdraw from them during that period. I think that's a good way to arrive at an asset allocation, to look back at, well, how long have stocks stayed down historically? It hasn't happened a lot that they flatlined over such a long period, but it's certainly within modern market history we've seen it. So I would plan for it.
So it sounds like you're advocating the old 60-40 portfolio, coming back to that. But with expected market returns going forward, given high valuations, is 70-30 the new 60-40?
Well, it's interesting. One conclusion that jumped out at people when we looked at our retirement income research from 2023 was when we ran our Monte Carlo simulations, the highest safe withdrawal amount, that 4% that we referenced previously, actually corresponded with the portfolio with just 20% to 40% in equities. If you took that equity allocation higher, somewhat counterintuitively, the safe withdrawal rate went down. And the key reason is that our simulation is responding to the fact that bond yields are quite high today. So the system is basically saying, hey, if you're telling me you want this very stable paycheck throughout retirement, let's line it up and lock it down in fixed income assets today, because that gives us the high probability of success with a fairly safe portfolio. But as we talked about, there are significant disadvantages to that sort of spending system. It's not necessarily for everyone, and it doesn't necessarily coincide with how people spend. Certainly for people who have a longer time horizon or a high bequest motive, they'd want to think about having a higher equity allocation. I certainly plan to come into retirement with a higher equity allocation than 20 to 40% equities.
Jackie, we have covered a
Yeah.
lot today. We may have overloaded our audience. Christine has just dropped so many knowledge bombs here. Do you have any final questions for her with regards to our topic today?
Yeah. Well, and this is just a little bit of a detour, but Christine, I've noticed the great work and research Morningstar has been doing around health savings accounts, HSAs, which is kind of new. And we talked about the retirement piece and how the healthcare costs start to really pick up later on in retirement. So do you think that that could be somehow part of the strategy as someone is getting ready to retire, want to try to use that 4% guideline? Like how does an HSA possibly fit into that to help be a little bit more of an extra, I guess, an extra factor in coming up with that number?
Yeah, it's hard not to love HSAs for people who are covered by a high deductible healthcare plan. And HSA is just such a great thing to add into your retirement savings toolkit if you're covered by a qualifying high deductible plan. And the basic idea is that the tax benefits are just phenomenal with HSAs, where you're putting pre-tax dollars into the HSA, you're enjoying tax-free compounding, so you can invest your HSA assets in something that earns a decent return over time. And then when you pull out those funds for qualified healthcare expenditures, they too are tax free. So, triple tax advantage. There's no other analog in the whole tax code in terms of various savings vehicles. So, I just think they're a great thing to bring along for the ride and a way to think about potentially covering healthcare costs late in life. I have been thinking a lot about long term care expenses and how to help people think about, well, if they don't want to buy long-term care insurance, which I think is pretty understandable given the premium increases that a lot of people have confronted. Well, how do you build some sort of a bulwark against long-term care? I think a health savings account can be a really nice a nice account to consider funding with an eye toward at least potentially building some defense against long-term care. And then if the circumstances work out positively and you don't have long-term care, you can use that HSA for other health care expenses. So I love HSAs. To cite our team's research, Fidelity's HSA was the top evaluated HSA in their study. It's good for people who are just saving and kind of spending from the HSA as they go, and also looked really good from the standpoint of people who are doing long-term investing in their HSAs as well.
Well, I feel good about that
Yeah,
because I'm a big fan of HSAs.
yeah,
Jackie is the HSA queen, and we're going to do
Oh, good.
an
yeah,
episode. No, she truly is. And we're going to do an
yeah.
episode on that for sure, just between the two of us. But I have my HSA at Fidelity, and I completely agree. So I feel like I got something right.
Yeah,
Yeah, and I
I
feel
love my
like the fire
HSA too.
community. Yeah, and the fire community, when someone's asking where should I open up an HSA, I would say Fidelity is the number one, and of course, the Morningstar research is often cited because it's an independent place to be able to evaluate for what uses are the best providers to get. So Christine, so our Catching Up to Fires, we talk a lot about community. And I think that the Bogleheads Conference, as Bill and I experienced, was just a great resource for community. So do you think it's something that our late starters would find valuable? Like tell us about this year, where it's at and all that, and what you think we would be able to get from it for our community of late starters.
Yeah, thanks, Jackie. It's such a wonderful community, and we do hold this annual conference, and it's this year in Minneapolis. It'll be in the fall, and we're just about to announce the details of the where and the when, but it'll be in the fall, which is a pretty nice time of year in Minneapolis, which I'm a Chicagoan, but I always say that it's just one of our best cities in the Midwest. I think it's the second best Midwest city after Chicago. So it's going to be there. We have not yet announced our lineup of speakers, but we have been building a dream team of speakers. And the really inspiring thing about the Bogleheads conference is that we don't pay any speakers. So everyone's there because they want to be there, because they believe in the value of education and empowering individuals to live their best lives, including their financial lives. So that's the cool thing about the conference, is that I think we get some of the best speakers, but we're not paying anyone. We're not covering anyone's travel expenses. People just say, yes, I will be there because I want to be part of this community. So it's great in terms of hearing from the speakers, but you referenced the community aspect of it, Jackie, and that's what I love, is just the sense of meeting other similarly minded people. We're going to be trying to do a little more around helping people at the same life stage or with some of the same interests meet up at this next conference. So widows and widowers, people who are embarking on financial independence journeys, or whatever the case might be, we're planning to do a little brainstorming around that to help build those communities naturally and give people an opportunity to get together with one another. And I would also say on an ongoing basis, the website bogleheads.org is just a tremendous forum and a tremendous community. And we also have Bogleheads chapters throughout the country where people can take part in these meetings on a monthly basis within their own geography or based on their own life stage. So I'm a big believer in the community, and I would also note that we have made a commitment to recording all of the conference proceedings for posterity because we know that not everyone can swing the admission fee. So we have hired a video crew each year to record all of the sessions, and we put them all out on YouTube, and they're all free, obviously. So that's another way that people can access some of the Bogleheads
Yeah,
resources.
I would put a plug in for it too, because you do have a sort of a finance 101 track where for our late starters that are just getting started, there's a couple different tracks and they can pick the track where, okay, this is what I need to do. These are the things I need to do to get my finances in order. So it does play to our crowd, so to speak. And then there's a more advanced track for those that want a more advanced approach and the trickier things that you can do with your
Yeah.
finances. You also have a new book coming out. I want to make sure we talk about that. Give us a little blurb on what you've done and what we can expect from this book.
Sure, it's almost all wrapped up, which feels really good. The book is a series of interviews, of 20 interviews on how to do some aspect of retirement. So we've talked about some of the people who I interview for the book. Mike Piper is one, Bill Bernstein is another. We cover non-financial and financial aspects of retirement, but each discussion is a lesson about how to do some aspect of retirement. So one of my favorites was with Laura Karstensen, who's a researcher, professor at Stanford, who talks about the value of relationships as we age, how many people leave their workplaces and leave behind relationships and don't necessarily have other relationships in place to pick up where those left off. So it focuses on financial, non-financial. The more I do this, the more I focus on the financial piece, the more I pick up clues that this is less than half financial. It's more about the non-financial stuff that really determines our happiness and our satisfaction with our retirement years. So the book covers both. It's been a really fun learning experience. I don't know, I always try to be kind of humble as I approach various topics. And I love that it's sort of by design says, you know what, there are these deep wells of knowledge on all sorts of topics all over the place. Let's go straight to some of these sources and get their wisdom about how to approach some of these matters. So that's kind of the thesis with the book.
Yeah, I've already pre-ordered mine, Bill. Have you pre-ordered yours yet? I pre-ordered mine.
I'm about to, and we would encourage everybody to write a review because that's how the book world gets to know about these important books. So you are all over the place. You do a lot for this community. You've done a lot for us today. We're really lucky that our audience gets to hear you, and I hope they support all of your work at Morningstar, this book, and all come to the Bogleheads conference. There's just so much to do, and I really feel fortunate to have met you in person. You mentioned community. I didn't have a voice when we met, but you were a good listener, and so we had a good chance. And you were busy with all of the administrative stuff, but you took time for all the people that came up to you. It was truly impressive, as did all the speakers. And they're real people. They're our heroes, but they're real people. So again, I would encourage folks to buy your book, check out Morningstar, and come to Bogleheads. They can't go wrong with any of those. Christine, thank you for being here with us today. Jackie, do you have any final words?
I do. My last final word, you mentioned Bogleheads and all the chapters, and I am a Boglehead. I don't think if I mentioned that to you before, Christine, but I'm a member of the Columbus chapter in Columbus, Ohio, and I met those guys during COVID. They're about an hour and a half from me, so I didn't really go in person, but they started doing the online, and these guys are like geniuses to me. I'm looking up to them like I'm a little kid, and one of the members, Mark, actually came to the conference last year. I got to hang out with him. And so my experience with the Bogleheads, it is very much a part of community. So I just want to shout them out, the Columbus, Ohio Bogleheads.
Awesome. Thanks, Jackie. And thanks to both of you. It's been my honor to be here with you. I loved meeting you both at Bogleheads and look forward to staying in touch on all this. I love what you're doing here.
Well, I'm going to look you up in Chicago because I did another right thing where I lived in Chicago for 20-something years. Loved it. We're now in Tennessee, but we visit frequently. Hopefully, you're willing to have lunch with me sometime soon.
Sounds awesome. Thank you both.
All right. Thanks again today. All right. We'll see you next
Thanks. Take
time.
care.
We'll see you next time on Catching Up to Fi. We look forward to all of the future guests. Please consider supporting us on the website with a Buy Me a Coffee approach. Send us a voicemail on the SpeakPipe. Send us an email. Ask us your questions. We've got Jackie now. She has the answers to everything. So take advantage of what we have now, and let's see you next week. Thanks again.
So, Bill, as you know, we cannot do this show without our amazing staff and the people that help us put this on. So our social media is Diana Falk, our editor, Fritz Bassard, and show notes are done by Sarah von Sternberg. We love them and they keep us going.
Yeah, I mean, this show wouldn't have the quality it has without our folks, our peeps. And we'd also like to give you a few calls to action for the show. We love our community and we hope you love us back. If you want to support the show and what we're doing, you can do that at Buy Me a Coffee, which is a platform that allows you to virtually say thank you if you get value from our content. The link is in the show notes, or you can head over to our website at catchinguptofi.com and click on the Support the Podcast tab at the top right. We hope you've enjoyed this episode of Catching Up to Fi. We would appreciate it if you could leave us a 5-star review so that our message can reach others.
While we are financial educators, and I'm a financial professional that loves to teach, our content is for general education and information purposes only. We are not providing financial, legal, or tax advice. Always do your own research or consult a professional before making important decisions.
We'll see you next time on Catching Up to Fi.